You there! Boy! What day is it?
Oi, Governor, today's the day that Oko was banned in Standard, it was.
Well, this is cause for celebration then, boy. Go to the market and bring me the fattest goose in the window.
Right good then, sir. I hear they've got one in the shop now that's 2 toughness.
Good then, boy. Go and fetch it for me. Wait a minute, didn't we sort of start the story here at the end?
Right you are then, Gov. As it turns out, starting stories has been banned as well.
Yo, I'm sorting through some heinous haters like a pooper scooper. I'm just trying to take my life like a Koopa Trooper. I'm Double Mario, that mean I'm super. And I'm freaking dangerous like a Chupa Cabre. Got them all day like a Kanye, but I'm way better getting cheddar in Monterey. But Jack, you don't know, man. You got the show, man. You want roast beef? Well, I'm Arby's.
What's up, my Wiznorfs? It's Dev from Mtg, aka Felonies or Scrooge. And today, I got the best job in the world because the moment we've mostly all been waiting on is finally upon us. Not only did Oko get banned, but along with it went Once Upon a Time. Makes sense, that's a broken Magic card. And Veil of Summer, probably the most pushed sideboard card we've seen in decades, perhaps. So that decision makes sense too. And along with that decision, I am suddenly back in demand. I know you've hated Standard for the majority of the season, so welcome back to the channel. Now that also leaves me, teleporting cat by the way, hey what's up Ziggy, but anyway, that also leaves me with a lot to discuss, and we've got a lot to talk about today. I've got to give you 3 decks that I think get a little bit better as a result of these bannings, and then 3 decks that I think get a little bit worse, or maybe just stay the same as a result of the bannings. Plus I've got another deck in the middle there that I'm not quite sure about, but I nonetheless think it's a fun thought experiment, and then a bunch of other decks on the fringes. There's so much to discuss today, so I want to go ahead and jump into it, but before we do, if you'll pardon you, dude, I just want to give you a chance to go ahead and like and subscribe if you haven't done those things. Do the YouTube stuff for you, dude. And also, if you're interested in any of the decks that we talk about today, I'll leave links in the description to each and every one of them. Down there, you can hit them, go over to TCGPLAYER, get the decks at the good prices. But anyway, let's go ahead and jump in and start talking about the decks that I think get a little bit better as a result of Monday's decisions. It might be controversial to start things out with this take, but even though BANT loses some obvious pieces, it still has a lot of the cards that made it dominant in the first place. The deck still carries Nissa, who shakes the world, a card a lot of folks speculated would be banned instead of, or along with Oko, and turn 1 Goose into turn 2 Paradise Druid into turn 3 Nissa is still a play the deck has access to, and remains one of the strongest turn sequences in Standard. Once you get Nissa down, you can still cast a huge Hydroid Krasis to cinch the game up, but if you need help bridging that gap, you've got Teferi Time Raveler to create tempo and make sure that your spells resolve. The biggest question about this deck, in my opinion, is whether or not it keeps playing Wicked Wolf without Oko to keep it knee-deep in snacks. That said, 2-for-1ing aggro decks might be more important than ever, so I wouldn't be surprised to see Wolf keep its position at BANT Incorporated. Going forward, I think BANT is the best build of ramp in the format, because the Simic builds no longer have the best card in Standard, and the Sultai builds, which were largely conceived to combat the mirror match, are also less powerful. BANT, however, retains the tools it needs to create space against the aggro and mid-range decks that will surely experience new life going forward, and despite losing some very powerful cards, the deck should hang on and continue to be a force in high-level play, which is a testament to how powerful the deck was in the first place. Now here's a deck that I think explodes in popularity because Oko is keeping it down on so many fronts. For one, just making food tokens every turn hurts any aggro deck, but turning the food and any geese laying around into 3/3s invalidated a lot of the smaller creatures in mono red, or they could just turn your Torbrand into a useless 3/3 with no text box. Finally, there was also the risk of getting your Torbrand or some other important creature straight up stolen by Oko's last ability. There's a reason that only one player showed up to Mythic Championship 5 with this deck, and it was nowhere to be found at Mythic Championship 6, and that reason is, by and large, Oko. There are still plenty of sweepers in the format that might keep this deck in check, but that's no guarantee given how fast the deck can be with a good opening hand, not to mention how many haste creatures the deck plays that help fight those board wipes. If there's anything that keeps mono red from rising in popularity, it might be the large number of mid-range decks that can either kill or go over the top of its creatures, but I still think mono red will cement its place as the premier aggro deck in the format. The deck that won Mythic Championship 5 did so because it was in a great position against the Field of the Dead decks that were so popular at the time. But when Field got banned and Oko decks became the norm, GRUUL faded from popularity, which is really something considering the deck wasn't all that popular to begin with. That may change soon, however, because the deck lost very little. It did lose some things, though, because Once Upon a Time was a great way for any green creature deck to shore up its opener, and Veil of Summer was the strongest Game 2 card in the format. It's hard to say those losses won't hurt the deck, but they don't detract too much from the core concept of playing a huge threat like Spellbreaker or Questing Beast each turn, and then finishing the game ahead of schedule with Embercleave. I think this deck does a good job of going over the top of smaller aggro decks like Mono Red and Mardu Knights, while still going underneath a lot of the grindier or more control-based builds in the meta. There are a few ways to go big right now, but if you want to go big and fast at the same time, GRUUL likely remains the best option. Bridging the gap between the decks that I think get better and the decks that I think get worse is a deck that I think provides a lot of interesting opportunities for analysis. In the very early days of Throne Standard, this was a promising deck, but it has proven to be a tier 2 or 3 strategy over the last month. Where the deck goes now is a difficult question. It's actually in a great position against the last deck we talked about and pretty much any other mid-range deck that tends to play one large threat every turn, but it's in a terrible position against decks where it plays Doom Foretold on turn 4 onto a board with Torbrand and 2 or 3 1-drops. The deck is just awful against anything that goes wide, especially decks like Selesnya Adventures, but it can get Oath of Kaya into Kaya's Wrath to turn the game around against those decks, but it more or less needs that turn sequence to have any hope against a deck that's filling the board quickly. However, on the third hand, there's also the fact that it goes long better than most other decks because it has a high degree of inevitability if it can manage to get into the very late game. This should theoretically give it a good matchup against BANT decks that are also trying to get to that same late game, because Dance is probably better than anything the BANT decks are doing on turn 12, and Doom Foretold is great against them in the meantime. All that information comes together to form a deck that seems very good in a format full of mid-range decks, but still hard to recommend right away in a format in which if you go second against Mono Red, you'll be at half your starting life total when you untap on turn 3, and a board full of Guild Globes and Golden Eggs doesn't seem very good in that situation. Now I know a lot of you are going to bristle at this because of course the adventure decks should be more viable without Oko in the format given that they were already viable before. I think you could make the argument that most every deck gets better with Oko gone, but we're here to look at which decks get the most viable after the okopacalypse, and I think that although adventures don't get a whole lot worse, they don't gain a whole lot either. If anything, the loss of Once Upon a Time will hit these decks very hard, because getting once into Edgewall Innkeeper on turn 1 was an enormously important sequence for both Golgari and Selesnya, and having Veil of Summer in the sideboard mattered a lot too. If anything, I think the Selesnya adventure deck stands to gain more than the Golgari version as it goes wide and does so really fast, but both decks will feel the loss of Once Upon a Time in a way that I think is going largely undetected in the excitement of the bans. Now, it pains me greatly to say that my favorite deck in the format will take a hit from this ban, but despite my desire to make a case for it, I can't help but think that since it rose to prominence as an answer to Oko, it will consequently fall in prominence now. Towards the end, the Oko decks and the Sacrifice decks even merge together, so in a way, the Sacrifice decks definitely lose out if we're talking about the Sacrifice builds that have been so popular for the last 2 weeks, the Sultai versions. Even the non-Sultai builds of the deck, like Jun's Sacrifice, are likely in trouble, as again, they were mostly a response to the Simic decks. Mayhem Devil ironically gets worse in a format where there's less food production on either side of the table, and Vraska's card quality takes a dip because she's no longer an answer to the best card in the format. That said, your Witches' Ovens and Korvalds and Mayhem Devils will never be turned into Elks ever again, unless your opponent is playing Kendra's Transformation for some reason, but there's still an argument for this deck. The Rakdos Sacrifice deck has been around since well before Field of the Dead was banned, so it's got street cred too. I'll root for this deck, but I think the viability of Aristocrats just dipped from 4 different builds down to 2, so the deck is technically worse by default. I just got done with 2 weeks of testing Fires decks, and with every build I played across close to 80 games, the one constant was that I didn't want the deck across the table from me to be fast. Fires was awesome because it didn't have any good targets for Oko, didn't care about its food production, and played lots of planeswalkers, which Oko decks are famously bad against. Fires does have access to sweepers, but if it doesn't get a Deafening Clarion on turn 3, it's going to be the game the vast majority of the time, and I think that's going to be a hard hill for the deck to climb in the new standard. This is yet another deck I really like that I nonetheless must remain objective about. Fires depended on a format that allowed it to consistently get to turn 5 or 6 without much pushback, and I think those days are gone, at least for the moment. Now for a bit of a lightning round to finish things up, because there are actually a lot of decks on the fringes of Standard that could rise in popularity now that things have changed. Simic Flash probably doesn't move much, and continues to be the definition of a deck that's solid, but no more or less than that. Azorius Control has been a dark horse contender against the green-blue X decks as of late because it can counter important plays and steal whatever does hit the table, but with both of its best sweepers at turn 5, I don't think the deck is worth much anymore, at least not on the surface. Similarly, Temur Reclamation preyed on Oko decks. It can't do that anymore. Reclamation all but folds to any deck playing fast, so I think its very small moment back in the sun is over at this point. However, there are some decks on the fringes to look out for. I like decks like green-black big stuff that play Gilded Goose and the Rotting Regisaur into the Great Hinge, and also have access to the turn 3 Nissa sequence. Regisaur and other overstated creatures in general just get much better in a format while they'll never get turned into 3/3s, so decks like Mono Green might be worth trying out, as it goes over the top of aggro, but is still fast enough to go under Doom Foretold and Fires of Invention decks. If you're going to go with big green, GRUUL is probably still your best bet though. But you know something else that gets better in a format where there's no way to turn creatures into textless 3/3s? Creatures with good text boxes. I know, it sounds nuts, but cards like Ironcrag Pyromancer are actually playable now, so maybe even the Is It draw your second card of the turn deck is worth exploring, although it's probably the longest shot on this list. That is all I got for today. Well, it's not all I got. I still got you, buddy. But anyway, that's all I got in terms of Magic talk for the day. Just let me know how you felt about all the takes down there in the comments section. If there's a deck that I missed, make sure you get to that too. There's plenty of spicy stuff to brew up in the coming days, but I wanted to go ahead and pause to take a look at all the decks we already know exist to see whether or not they get good or get worse or whatever. You know, I think it's a very interesting experiment to take part in. But in any case, let me know how you felt about it down there. Check out the deck list in the description down there to TCG Player, and do all the other stuff like subscribe, join the Patreon to support content like this, and pick what decks we even do here on the channel. But aside from that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here because I got lots to brew up. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.